The morning sun hung low over Naval Base Coronado, casting long shadows across the training grounds, where 15 young men stood frozen in absolute silence. Water dripped steadily from the face of a woman in civilian clothes. Her white t-shirt clung to her skin, transparent now, revealing the athletic build beneath. Droplets fell from her chin onto the concrete, each one marking time in the suspended moment. Sergeant First Class Garrett Weston stood 3 feet away, his hands still gripping the empty water bottle. The confidence that had driven him to throw it had evaporated the instant the water left the plastic. His face had gone pale, not the healthy pale of someone who'd simply been startled, but the bloodless white of a man watching his entire career disintegrate before his eyes. The woman wiped water from her eyes with the back of her hand. Then she did something none of the recruits expected. She laughed. Not a bitter, angry laugh, but genuine amusement that seemed to come from somewhere deep and true. "Well," she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent training ground, "that's certainly one way to welcome the new commanding officer." Garrett's knees nearly buckled. The water bottle fell from his hand, bouncing twice on the concrete before rolling away into the dust. 24 hours earlier, everything had been different. The unmarked government sedan rolled through the main gate of Naval Base Coronado just after dawn on December 14th. The Marine on duty checked the credentials without much interest, waved the vehicle through, and returned to his post. He had no way of knowing that the woman in the back seat would change everything about SEAL Team 7. Captain Addison Thorne watched the base wake up through tinted windows. She'd specifically requested this arrival. No ceremony, no honor guard, no press of officers waiting to curry favor with the new commanding officer. Just a quiet entrance that would let her see what she was inheriting before anyone knew to put on a show. At 38, Addison had spent 18 years in service, 18 years of blood, sweat, and decisions that haunted her sleep, 18 years of proving herself in a world that had never been designed for women like her. The sedan stopped near the administrative buildings far from the training areas. Addison stepped out wearing faded jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and sneakers that had seen better days. Dark sunglasses hid her sharp green eyes. To anyone watching, she looked like a civilian contractor, maybe someone's wife visiting the base. Exactly as she'd planned. She slung a small backpack over one shoulder and started walking. The driver had offered to wait, but she declined. She needed to be alone for this. Needed to feel the base, understand its rhythms, see how her new command operated when they thought no one important was watching. The December air carried the salt smell of the Pacific. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries mixing with the distant sound of a drill sergeant's voice. Addison let her feet carry her toward the training grounds drawn by muscle memory and instinct honed over nearly 2 decades. Her phone buzzed. A text from Admiral Preston. Ready for tomorrow's ceremony. Tomorrow, the official change of command, the moment when she would stand before SEAL Team 7 in dress whites and accept responsibility for 147 of the most elite warriors in the world, the youngest female commanding officer in naval special warfare history. She didn't respond to the text. Preston would understand. He'd been the one to approve her unorthodox arrival after all. Addison's mind drifted backward as she walked. Somalia 2050. She'd been 28 and a SALT team leader with 8 years behind her. 3 American journalists had been taken hostage by militants in Mogadishu. The situation had stretched into its 48th hour when her team got the green light. She could still feel the weight of her gear, the way her rifle had settled against her shoulder as they breached the compound. The split-second decisions as they moved room to room. The moment she'd locked eyes with the first hostage, a woman named Sarah, who'd been certain she was going to die in that place. They'd brought all 3 hostages home. 0 civilian casualties, 0 friendly casualties. Textbook execution under pressure that made most people crack. The Navy Cross had followed, then promotions, then assignments that took her further from the field and closer to command. Pentagon briefings, training doctrine development. The slow, grinding process of changing a system that still struggled with the idea of women in special operations. She'd never wanted command. She'd wanted to be an operator, pure and simple. But you didn't say no when the Navy asked, especially not when saying yes meant you could change things for the women coming up behind you. The training grounds came into view. Even from a distance, Addison could hear the distinctive cadence of military instruction, the sharp bark of orders, the rhythmic sound of boots hitting pavement, the metallic click of weapons being assembled and disassembled. A group of recruits was gathered around a senior enlisted man. Even from this distance, Addison could read the body language. Confidence, experience, authority earned through blood and time. She moved closer, staying to the edge of the training area, observing. This was what she'd come for, to see her new command in its natural state, unvarnished and real. Sergeant First Class Garrett Weston had been drilling the same basic movements for an hour, but his patience hadn't wavered. At 34, he'd spent the last 8 years with SEAL Team 7, and before that 6 years proving himself worthy of the trident he wore with such pride. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from functional strength rather than gym vanity. His uniform was immaculate, boots polished to a mirror shine despite the dust of the training ground. The 15 recruits in front of him represented the future of naval special warfare, and he took that responsibility with deadly seriousness. Again, he said, his voice carrying the weight of earned authority. Combat reload, smooth as fast, fast as smooth. The recruits moved through the drill. Garrett watched each one, noting who had natural aptitude and who was still fighting their own nervous system. Seaman Devlin fumbled the magazine change. Garrett was on him immediately, not harsh but firm, correcting the grip, the angle, the motion. Your weapon is an extension of your body, Devlin. You don't think about moving your arm. You don't think about this either. Garrett had learned to train from the best, and he'd learned the cost of poor training from the worst. His mind went where it always did when he thought about training. Syria, 2010, 6 years ago now, but it might as well have been yesterday. Petty Officer Second Class Michael Sullivan had been his swim buddy, his brother in every way that mattered. They'd served together for 3 years, survived 2 deployments, trusted each other with their lives. And then they'd gotten a commanding officer who'd been promoted too fast, given authority before he'd earned the wisdom to wield it. The mission brief had been sloppy, the intelligence questionable, but orders were orders, and they'd gone anyway. Sullivan had died because their CO had frozen when the situation turned bad. A simple decision, the kind you made 100 times in combat, and the man had just locked up. By the time someone else took control, it was too late. Garrett had carried Sullivan's body out of that compound, had stood watch at Arlington National Cemetery while they played taps, had made a promise to himself that he would never let poor leadership cost another operator their life. Since then, he'd been protective of his training ground to the point of obsession. Some people thought he was too inflexible, too by the book. 3 times he'd been passed over for promotion to Master Chief, and 3 times the reason had been some variation of needs to be more adaptable in his approach. Garrett didn't care. He knew what adaptable got you. It got you dead friends and folded flags. He was demonstrating proper room entry techniques when he noticed movement at the edge of the training area, a figure approaching from the direction of the administrative buildings. Civilian clothes, female, walking with confidence but clearly heading toward a restricted zone. Garrett's jaw tightened. Civilians wandered into training areas more often than they should. Usually family members who didn't understand base protocols or contractors who'd taken a wrong turn. Either way, they needed to be redirected immediately. Training with live weapons didn't mix with unauthorized personnel. Continue the drill, he told the recruits, then turned toward the approaching woman. Ma'am, he called out, his voice firm but professional, you need to leave this area immediately. This is a restricted training zone. The woman kept walking, not ignoring him exactly, but not stopping either. She was maybe 50 yards away now, close enough that Garrett could see she wore sunglasses and had her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. Garrett felt his irritation tick upward. In his experience, people who ignored clear directions from military personnel usually fell into one of 2 categories. Either they didn't understand English well enough, or they thought the rules didn't apply to them. Either way, the solution was the same. Remove them quickly and get back to training. Ma'am, he called again, louder this time. I said you need to leave this area. This is military property and you're interfering with training operations. Behind him, several of the recruits had stopped their drill to watch. Garrett was aware of their eyes on him, aware that how he handled this would send a message. Seaman Holloway looked particularly interested, which meant the kid was probably learning the wrong lesson. Eyes on your weapon, Holloway, Garrett snapped without turning around. This doesn't concern you. The woman finally stopped walking. She was 30 yards away now, close enough that Garrett could see she was probably in her late 30s. She carried herself with unusual confidence for a civilian. Something about her posture suggested she was comfortable in her own skin, unintimidated by the setting or his tone. "I'm just observing," she said, her voice calm and level. "I won't interfere with your training." Garrett felt a flash of anger. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a restricted military training area, and he had 15 young men learning skills that could mean the difference between life and death. He didn't have time for civilians who thought military bases were tourist attractions. "Listen, lady," he said, taking several steps toward her. "I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't a place for spectators. Military training exercises are serious business. You need to turn around and walk back the way you came." The recruits had stopped their drill entirely now. All 15 pairs of eyes were locked on the unfolding confrontation. Garrett was peripherally aware of this, and it only added to his frustration. Every second spent dealing with this woman was a second stolen from training that could save lives downrange. The woman didn't move. She stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, weight balanced. That posture again. Something about it nagged at Garrett, but he couldn't place it. "I understand your concerns about security," she replied, maintaining that same calm tone. "But I have authorization to be here." Garrett stopped about 10 feet away from her, his hands resting on his hips. He looked her up and down, taking in the civilian clothes, the casual appearance, the complete absence of any visible credentials. Nothing about her suggested official business or military authorization. "Authorization from who?" he demanded. "Show me your identification and your access papers." The woman tilted her head slightly, and even through the dark sunglasses, Garrett could feel her studying him, measuring him. It was the way a fellow operator looked at you, sizing up capabilities and intentions. But that was impossible. She was just a civilian who'd wandered into the wrong area. "I'd prefer not to at this time," she said carefully. "But I assure you I have every right to be here." That was it. That was the line that pushed Garrett past professional irritation and into genuine anger. In the military, you produced identification when asked. Period. The fact that this woman was refusing to comply with his reasonable request meant she was either lying about her authorization or involved in something that didn't pass the smell test. "Ma'am," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I'm going to ask you one more time to produce identification or leave the area. If you refuse, I'll have to call security to escort you off the premises." The tension was thick enough to cut. 15 recruits stood motionless, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Garrett could feel their eyes on him, feel the weight of having an audience for this confrontation. The woman remained maddeningly calm. No nervousness, no fear. Most civilians would have been backing down by now, intimidated by his size, his tone, his obvious authority in this space. But she just stood there, relaxed and centered, as if she had all the time in the world. Garrett pulled out his radio, thumb hovering over the transmit button. He was about to call for backup when something made him pause. Despite the stress of the situation, the woman showed no signs of the anxiety that should have been there. Her breathing was steady, her hands weren't shaking, her posture remained balanced and alert. It reminded him of something. Someone. The way operators carried themselves after years of training and deployments. That quiet confidence that came from having been tested and not found wanting. But that was impossible. She was wearing jeans and sneakers. Her hair was in a ponytail. She looked like someone's soccer mom, not a military professional. For the first time since the confrontation began, Garrett felt a flicker of uncertainty, but his pride and sense of duty wouldn't allow him to back down now. This was his training area. These were his recruits. He had a responsibility to maintain security and discipline, regardless of who this woman might or might not be. "Last warning," he said, keying his radio. "Either show me identification or prepare to be escorted off base." The woman sighed quietly, not dramatically, just a small exhalation that suggested the situation had gone further than she'd intended. She reached toward her back pocket, and for a brief moment, Garrett tensed his operator's instincts, screaming at him even though he wasn't sure why. "Sergeant Weston," she said, using his rank for the first time. Garrett's eyes narrowed. How did she know his rank? His name tape was visible on his uniform, but his rank insignia wasn't clearly displayed from her position. And even if it were, most civilians wouldn't be able to read military insignia at this distance. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she continued. But Garrett was past listening. His patience had finally snapped. All he could see was a civilian who'd wandered into his training area, refused to follow direct orders, and was now trying to talk her way out of the consequences. He'd been professional. He'd been clear. He'd given her multiple chances to comply, and she'd ignored all of it. Without fully thinking through the action, Garrett grabbed the water bottle attached to his tactical vest. It was half full cold from sitting in the December morning air. In one smooth motion, he unscrewed the cap and hurled the contents directly at the woman's face. The water hit her square on, splashing across her face and soaking through her white t-shirt. She stumbled back slightly from the unexpected assault. "Maybe that will cool you down and help you understand that I'm serious," Garrett said, his voice rough with anger and frustration. "This is what happens when civilians think they can waltz into military installations and ignore direct orders from military personnel." The recruits gasped audibly. Seaman Devlin's mouth fell open. Seaman Tate took an involuntary step backward. Even Seaman Holloway, who'd seen Garrett be stern and demanding, had never witnessed their instructor lose control like this. The woman stood there, water streaming down her face and neck, pooling at her feet. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, complete silence fell over the training ground. Everyone waited to see how she would respond, and then she laughed. It started as a quiet chuckle, but quickly grew into genuine amusement. She wiped water from her eyes with the back of her hand, shaking her head in a way that suggested amazement rather than anger. "Well," she said, her voice carrying a hint of irony that sent a chill down Garrett's spine, "that's certainly one way to welcome the new commanding officer." The color drained from Garrett's face. Around him, the recruits started to murmur among themselves, pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place. Garrett felt his stomach drop, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman reached into her back pocket and pulled out a waterproof document holder. Of course it was waterproof. Of course she'd been prepared. She extracted a military identification card and a set of official orders, holding them out for Garrett to examine. His hands trembled slightly as he took the documents. The identification card was clear and unmistakable. Captain Addison Thorne, United States Navy SEALs. The photo showed the same woman who now stood before him, soaked and dripping. The assignment orders were equally unambiguous. Effective December 15th, Captain Addison Thorne was to assume command of SEAL Team 7 at Naval Base Coronado, California. The orders bore official seals and signatures from the highest levels of the Pentagon. Admiral Preston's signature was right there at the bottom. Garrett felt the blood drain from his face as the magnitude of his mistake crashed over him like a wave. He'd just thrown water on his new commanding officer, humiliated her in front of junior personnel, treated her with utter disrespect. In military terms, what he'd done bordered on insubordination and assault of a superior officer. "Ma'am," he stammered, his earlier confidence evaporated. I had no idea. You weren't in uniform and you didn't identify yourself. I thought you were just a civilian who had wandered into the wrong area." Captain Thorne took back her identification and carefully returned it to the waterproof holder. She pulled the wet fabric of her t-shirt and away from her skin, clearly considering how to handle this delicate situation. Garrett could see it now, all the signs he'd missed. The way she moved, the alertness in her eyes, the confidence that came from years of training in combat. How had he not seen it? How had he been so blind? "Sergeant First Class Garrett Weston," she said formally, using his full rank and name. "I assume you are one of the senior NCOs assigned to my unit." "Yes, ma'am," Garrett replied, snapping to attention. "Sergeant First Class Garrett Weston, assigned to SEAL Team 7 for the past 8 years. The recruits watched this exchange with fascination and growing concern. They could see their tough-as-nails instructor reduced to a nervous wreck, and they were beginning to understand that they'd just witnessed something that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Captain Thorne walked in a slow circle around Garrett as he stood at attention. Her wet shoes squeaked against the concrete with each step. She was using this time to think, to process, to decide how to proceed. Garrett kept his eyes forward, but he could feel her presence as she moved behind him, beside him, in front of him again. "Tell me, Sergeant Weston," she said as she completed her circle and stood directly in front of him, "what do you think should happen to a non-commissioned officer who assaults his commanding officer?" Garrett swallowed hard. He knew that his career was potentially hanging in the balance. Courts-martial had been convened for far less serious offenses. An assault of a superior officer was one of the most serious charges in the military justice system. Ma'am, according to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, such an action would be grounds for court-martial reduction in rank and possible imprisonment, he replied, his voice steady despite his obvious distress. Specifically, Article 128, assault of a superior commissioned officer. That's correct, Captain Thorne confirmed. It would also mean the end of your military career and the loss of all benefits and retirement pay. Is that what you want? No, ma'am, Garrett replied immediately. But I accept full responsibility for my actions, and I'm prepared to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate. Captain Thorne nodded slowly. Despite his catastrophic mistake, Garrett was showing integrity by accepting responsibility rather than making excuses or trying to shift blame. That character trait would matter in the next few minutes. She turned to address the group of recruits who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes. Most of them were fresh out of basic training and had never seen a situation like this unfold in real time. What you have witnessed here today will serve as an important lesson, she announced, her voice carrying easily across the training area. In the military, assumptions can be dangerous. Things are not always what they appear to be, and jumping to conclusions can have serious consequences. She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. The recruits stood at attention now, understanding that they were receiving instruction that would stay with them for the rest of their military careers. However, you have also witnessed something equally important. Sergeant Weston acted based on what he believed to be legitimate security concerns. His mistake was not in challenging someone he thought didn't belong here, but in escalating the situation beyond what was necessary and letting his emotions override his judgment. The recruits nodded solemnly. Captain Thorne turned back to Garrett, who was still at attention, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the relatively cool morning air. Sergeant Weston, I want you to understand something, she said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. I came here today in civilian clothes specifically because I wanted to observe my new unit without the artificial behavior that typically accompanies a change of command. I wanted to see how my people really acted when they thought no one important was watching. Garrett remained silent, but Captain Thorne could see understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. What I saw was a non-commissioned officer who was serious about security, protective of his trainees, and unwilling to back down from what he believed was right, she continued. Those are qualities I value in my subordinates, even when they're directed at me inappropriately. Garrett's shoulders relaxed slightly as he began to sense that perhaps his career wasn't over after all. However, Captain Thorne added, her voice becoming stern again, your methods were unacceptable. Throwing water on someone, regardless of who they are, is not appropriate military conduct. Do you understand that? Yes, ma'am, absolutely, Garrett replied without hesitation. Captain Thorne was quiet for several long moments as she considered her options. She could pursue formal charges against Garrett, which would likely end his career, and send a strong message about respecting authority. Alternatively, she could use this incident as a teaching moment and an opportunity to establish her leadership style from the very beginning. The decision would set the tone for her entire command. Every person present would remember this moment for years to come. How she handled this situation would determine whether her subordinates saw her as fair but firm, or as someone who would destroy careers over mistakes. Finally, she made her choice. Sergeant Weston, she began, her voice clear and authoritative. What you did was wrong, and under normal circumstances, it would result in formal disciplinary action. However, I believe that good leaders know when to use discipline as a teaching tool rather than a weapon of destruction. Garrett continued standing at attention, but Captain Thorne could see the relief beginning to show in his posture. Here's what's going to happen, she continued. You will personally oversee the training of every new recruit that comes through this unit for the next 6 months. You will teach them about respect, proper military bearing, and the importance of following procedures. Most importantly, you will tell each one of them the story of what happened here today and what you learned from it. Garrett's eyes widened slightly at this unexpected assignment. Rather than being punished, he was being given additional responsibility and trusted with the education of future SEALs. Furthermore, Captain Thorne added, you will serve as my senior enlisted advisor for the first 90 days of my command. I want someone who isn't afraid to speak their mind, even when it might be uncomfortable. Your willingness to challenge someone you thought didn't belong here tells me that you have the courage to give me honest feedback when I need it. Garrett felt a mixture of gratitude and amazement wash over him. He'd expected his career to be over. Instead, he was being given positions of greater trust and responsibility. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say, except thank you for giving me this opportunity to make things right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise you won't regret this decision." "I'm counting on that, Sergeant," Captain Thorne replied. "But understand this clearly. This is your one free pum. If you ever again let emotion override your judgment, if you ever again treat anyone with the kind of disrespect you showed me today, there will be no second chances. Are we clear on that?" "Crystal clear, ma'am," Garrett responded immediately. Captain Thorne turned back to address the recruits one final time. "As for all of you," she said, "let today serve as a lesson in leadership accountability and second chances. Good leaders don't destroy people for making mistakes. They help them learn from those mistakes and become better operators." She paused to scan the faces of the young men who would soon be serving under her command in some of the most dangerous missions imaginable. However, she continued, her tone becoming more serious. "Don't mistake compassion for weakness. I expect the highest standards of conduct and performance from every member of this unit. We are Navy SEALs, and that means we represent the very best of the American military. Every action you take, every word you speak, and every decision you make reflects on this team and this uniform." The recruits stood straighter, understanding that they were receiving guidance that would shape their entire military careers. The December sun climbed higher in the California sky. In the distance, other training exercises continued, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. Captain Addison Thorne looked at the men assembled before her and smiled slightly. Tomorrow would be the official ceremony, the speeches and presentations and military pageantry. But this moment right here was what leadership really looked like. Messy, uncomfortable, human, and absolutely essential. The morning continued as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Captain Thorne walked over to a bench near the training area and sat down, apparently unconcerned about her damp clothes drying in the December sun. She pulled a small notebook from her waterproof backpack and began making notes, her pen moving steadily across the page. Garrett stood motionless for a moment, still processing what had just happened. He'd gone from thinking his career was over to being given additional responsibilities and the trust of his new commanding officer. The whiplash of emotions left him slightly dizzy. "Sergeant Weston," Captain Thorne called out without looking up from her notebook, "I believe you had a training schedule to complete." Garrett snapped back to focus. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am." He turned to face the 15 recruits who were still standing in various states of shock. Seaman Devlin looked like he might faint. Seaman Tate kept glancing between Garrett and the captain, trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. Even Seaman Holloway, usually cocky and overconfident, seemed subdued. "All right, listen up," Garrett said, forcing his voice back into instructor mode. "What you just saw was a masterclass in leadership under pressure. Captain Thorne could have ended my career with a single radio call. Instead, she chose to teach. That's the difference between authority and leadership. Remember it." The recruits nodded, more focused now than they'd been all morning. "Now we've got 4 more hours of training ahead of us, and we've already lost 30 minutes. Double time for weapons qualifications. Move out." The recruits scrambled to gather their gear and form up. As they jogged toward the firing range, Garrett risked a glance back at Captain Thorne. She was still writing in her notebook, occasionally looking up to observe the base operations around her. If the water incident had rattled her, she showed no sign of it. The morning progressed through the standard training curriculum. Garrett supervised range safety as the recruits worked through their M4 carbine qualifications. Each man had to demonstrate proficiency at various distances, prove they could handle malfunctions, and execute combat reloads under time pressure. Captain Thorne remained on the bench, watching from a distance. She'd removed her sunglasses now, and Garrett could feel her eyes tracking every movement, every instruction, every interaction. It should have made him nervous, but instead he found himself working harder, being more precise with his corrections, more thoughtful with his explanations. By noon, the recruits had completed their qualifications. The scores were typical for men at this stage of training. A few standouts, most in the acceptable range, a couple who would need additional work. Garrett was recording the results in his logbook when a voice spoke from directly behind him. "What's the base record for this qualification course?" Garrett turned to find Captain Thorne standing close enough that he could see the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, lines earned over years of squinting into the sun in places most people would never see. 96 out of 100, ma'am, he replied. Set by Chief Petty Officer Langford 3 years ago. Captain Thorne nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the firing line. Is there time for one more shooter? Garrett blinked. Ma'am, I'd like to run the qualification course, if it won't interfere with your schedule. The recruits had been breaking down their gear, but now they froze, sensing something interesting was about to happen. Garrett felt a flutter of uncertainty. Officers running qualification courses with enlisted personnel wasn't unheard of, but it was unusual. And for the new commanding officer to do it on her first day, still wearing civilian clothes no less, was unprecedented. But he'd just been given a second chance by this woman. If she wanted to shoot, he'd make it happen. Not a problem, ma'am. We can have you set up in 5 minutes. Garrett sent Seaman Tate to retrieve a loaner M4 from the arms room while he prepared the firing line. The recruits had stopped even pretending to break down their gear. They stood in a loose semicircle, watching with undisguised interest. Captain Thorne accepted the rifle from Tate with a nod of thanks. She checked the chamber, inspected the magazine, well-tested the action. Her movements were fluid and automatic, the kind that came from having done something thousands of times until it became as natural as breathing. She looked up at Garrett. Standard qualification protocol. Yes, ma'am. 50 rounds at various distances, timed drills, combat reloads required between stages. And your recruits will be watching. I can clear them out if you prefer, ma'am. Captain Thorne smiled, and for the first time since the water incident, Garrett saw genuine warmth in it. No, let them watch. They should see what good looks like. Garrett called the line hot and started the course. What happened over the next 12 minutes would become legend at Naval Base Coronado. Captain Thorne moved through the qualification course like water finding its path downhill. No wasted motion, no hesitation. At 50 yards, she put 5 rounds into a grouping tight enough to cover with a quarter. At 100 yards, her breathing control was so perfect that Garrett could barely detect the rise and fall of her shoulders between shots. The combat reloads were what really caught his attention. Most shooters, even experienced ones, had a slight pause when changing magazines. A moment where muscle memory competed with conscious thought. Captain Thorne had no such pause. Her hands moved independently of her conscious mind, dropping empty magazines, seating fresh ones, getting back on target in less than 2 seconds. When the course ended and the line went cold, Garrett walked down to inspect the targets. He'd been keeping a mental tally as she shot, but seeing the results on paper was different. 98 out of 100, 2 points better than Chief Langford's 3-year-old record. Garrett turned back to where Captain Thorne stood, clearing the rifle. The recruits were silent, stunned into a kind of reverent awe. Even Seaman Holloway, who'd been skeptical about female officers since day one of training, looked like he'd just witnessed something that fundamentally challenged his worldview. New base record, ma'am, Garrett announced, his voice carrying across the range. 98 out of 100. Captain Thorne nodded as if he'd told her the time of day. The 2 I missed were at 300 yards. Wind call was off. She handed the rifle back to Seaman Tate, then turned to address the assembled recruits. Accuracy is important, but you know what's more important, knowing when not to shoot. The real test of a warrior isn't hitting what you aim at, it's having the judgment to choose your targets wisely. The recruits hung on every word. In the span of one morning, they'd watch their hard-as-nails instructor get humiliated, then pardon, then witness their new commanding officer break a base record while wearing jeans and a t-shirt that was only now finally dry. Garrett cleared his throat. Ma'am, if you're available, we have CQB drills scheduled for 1,400 hours. Room clearing and hostage rescue scenarios. Captain Thorne checked her watch. An old Luminox, the kind SEALs wore because they were functional rather than fashionable. I'll observe. But first I need to change into something more appropriate. Can't run shoot houses in sneakers. She'd come prepared. Of course she had. Somewhere in that small backpack was workout gear, because Captain Addison Thorne didn't do anything halfway. At precisely 1,400 hours, the recruits assembled at the close quarters battle training facility. The shoot house was a modular structure designed to simulate everything from residential homes to office buildings. Rooms could be reconfigured, obstacles added or removed, and scenarios adjusted to create nearly infinite training possibilities. Garrett was briefing the first team when Captain Thorne emerged from the locker room. She now wore standard PT gear tactical boots, and her hair was pulled back in a tight braid. She looked like she belonged, like she'd been part of Team 7 forever. What followed was a masterclass in close quarters combat. Captain Thorne didn't just observe. She participated. She ran through the shoot house as part of a four-man team moving with the kind of synchronized precision that took most operators years to develop. She flowed through doorways like smoke, her weapon always oriented on the greatest threat, her communication crisp and minimal. The scenario was a hostage rescue. 3 hostile targets, 2 friendly hostages, multiple rooms with limited visibility. Time limit of 90 seconds from breach to extraction. Captain Thorne's team completed it in 73 seconds. Perfect target discrimination. 0 hits on hostages. Textbook execution from entry to exit. When Garrett checked the timer and announced the result, several of the recruits actually applauded. It was a breach of protocol, but Garrett let it slide. Sometimes rules mattered less than moments. Chief Petty Officer James Langford had been watching from the observation deck. At 41 with 12 years in special operations, Langford was one of the most experienced operators on the base. He was also the man whose shooting record had just been broken. He descended from the observation deck and approached Captain Thorne as she was removing her safety gear. The recruits went quiet, sensing another significant moment. "Captain Thorne," Langford said, coming to attention. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." "Granted, Chief." Langford's weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "That was exceptional shooting today, ma'am. And I've got to say it's about damn time someone beat my record. I was starting to think it would stand forever." Captain Thorne extended her hand and Langford shook it firmly. "You've set a high standard, Chief. I'm honored to serve with you." "The honor's ours, ma'am." Langford paused, then added, "I don't know if the sergeant told you, but I served with you before, indirectly. Helmand Province 2013. You were with Team 3 providing overwatch for a convoy extraction. One of those vehicles was carrying my team." Captain Thorne's expression shifted slightly, memory clearly working. "The ambush at the mountain pass." "Yes, ma'am. Your team put down 17 enemy combatants in under 2 minutes. Saved all our lives. I never got a chance to say thank you properly." The observation deck had filled with other operators who'd heard through the base grapevine that something interesting was happening. Petty Officer Beckett, the team medic, stood next to several other veterans. They'd all stopped what they were doing to bear witness to this exchange. "You don't owe me thanks, Chief," Captain Thorne said quietly. "That's what we do. We bring each other home." But Langford wasn't finished. "Ma'am, there's been some talk. Some of the guys wondering what it would be like having a female CO. Wondering if you earned this command or if it was politics." He turned to address the assembled group, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Any man who questions Captain Thorne's qualifications can come see me personally, because I've seen her under fire and I've seen her shoot, and I'm here to tell you that we're damn lucky to have her." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Whatever skepticism might have existed among the veterans of Team 7, it was evaporating in the face of demonstrated competence. Captain Thorne nodded her acknowledgement, then glanced at her watch. "Gentlemen, I've taken up enough of your training day. Sergeant Weston, carry on with your curriculum. I'll be in the area if you need me." As she walked away, Garrett heard Seaman Devlin whisper to Seaman Tate, "Did we just watch the CO break 2 records in one day?" "Shut up, Devlin," Garrett said without heat. But he was thinking the same thing. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of standard training. By 1800 hours, the recruits were exhausted, their muscles trembling from the day's exertions. Garrett dismissed them with instructions to report for morning PT at 0530, then began the process of securing equipment and filing reports. He was logging the day's qualification scores when Captain Thorne appeared beside him again. She had an uncanny ability to move quietly for someone who'd just spent the day demonstrating lethal competence. "Sergeant Weston, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to speak with you privately." Garrett's stomach tightened reflexively, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. "Of course, ma'am." They walked away from the training areas toward a quiet section of the base where individual equipment, storage lockers lined a covered walkway. The December sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The temperature was dropping, carrying the evening chill that always came with coastal California winters. Captain Thorne leaned against one of the concrete support pillars, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert. "I want you to be completely honest with me about something, Sergeant. What are the biggest challenges facing this unit right now?" Garrett considered the question carefully. His new commanding officer was giving him an opportunity to provide valuable input, and after the morning's disaster, he wanted to make sure his answer was both honest and helpful. "Ma'am, I think our biggest challenge is complacency," he said after a moment. "We've been very successful in recent missions, 18 months without a significant failure. Some of the team members are starting to think we're invincible. That kind of attitude gets people killed in our line of work." Captain Thorne nodded, encouraging him to continue. "The second problem is integration," Garrett added. "We've got a divide between the veterans who've been here for years and the newer operators who are still proving themselves. Some of the veterans have a tendency to exclude the newer guys from important discussions and decision-making processes. It creates resentment and prevents us from operating as a truly unified team." "Those are both legitimate concerns," Captain Thorne agreed. "What would you recommend we do about them?" Garrett was surprised by the question. In his experience, most commanding officers wanted to hear about problems, but preferred to develop their own solutions. The fact that Captain Thorne was asking for his recommendations suggested she genuinely valued his input. "For the complacency issue, I think we need more challenging training scenarios," he suggested. "Maybe some exercises where we're expected to fail occasionally just to remind everyone that we're not invincible. Nothing breaks down ego faster than a well-designed training evolution that exposes our weaknesses." "And for the integration problem, mixed teams for everything," Garrett replied without hesitation. "No more allowing the veterans to work only with other veterans. Every mission, every training exercise, every project should have a mix of experience levels. Force them to work together until they start trusting each other." Captain Thorne smiled. "Those are exactly the kinds of recommendations I was hoping to hear. We'll start implementing those changes next week." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower toward the Pacific horizon. Then Captain Thorne spoke again, her voice quieter, now more personal. "You mentioned earlier that you lost a teammate. Would you mind telling me about it?" Garrett felt his chest tighten. He didn't talk about Sullivan often. Most of the time, he kept that pain locked away in a place where it couldn't interfere with his duties. But something about Captain Thorne's tone, the genuine interest without pity, made him want to answer. "Petty Officer Second Class Michael Sullivan," Garrett said. "We were swim buddies. Served together for 3 years. Syria 2019. We had a CO who'd been promoted too fast. Good man, but not ready for the responsibility. The mission went sideways, and when it mattered most, he froze. And Sullivan paid the price," Captain Thorne finished quietly. "Yes, ma'am. By the time someone else took control of the situation, it was too late. I carried his body out myself. Stood at his funeral at Arlington. Promised myself I'd never let poor leadership cost another operator their life." Captain Thorne was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of shared experience. "I know that Syria mission sergeant. I was the investigating officer who recommended that CO be relieved of command." Garrett turned to look at her directly, genuinely surprised. "You were..." "I reviewed the entire operation. Interviewed every team member. Read Sullivan's service record. What happened to him should never have happened. The man who commanded that mission had no business being in that position, and I made sure he never commanded operators again." Something shifted in Garrett's chest. All this time, he'd been carrying anger at a system that had failed Sullivan. But here was someone who'd actually held that system accountable. Someone who'd made sure it wouldn't happen again. "That's why you're so protective of your training ground," Captain Thorne continued. "You're not just training recruits. You're trying to make sure no one else becomes another Sullivan." Garrett felt his throat tighten. "Yes, ma'am, that's exactly it. I understand that instinct, Sergeant. I share it. But here's what I need you to understand. Protecting people from danger is part of our job. But we can't protect them from everything. Sometimes the best we can do is train them well enough that they can protect themselves." She pushed away from the concrete pillar and turned to face him fully. "Tomorrow there's going to be a change of command ceremony. Speeches and uniforms and all the formal pageantry that comes with these transitions. But what happened today, what we've talked about tonight, this is the real change of command. This is when we figure out if we can work together." "I think we can, ma'am," Garrett said with conviction he genuinely felt. "So do I." Captain Thorne extended her hand. "Thank you for your honesty today, Sergeant, both about the unit's challenges and about your own motivations. That kind of transparency is exactly what I need from my senior enlisted advisor. Garrett shook her hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who'd earned every callus and scar. Thank you for the second chance, ma'am. I won't waste it. As they walked back toward the main base facilities, Garrett found himself thinking about the strange trajectory of this day. It had started with him certain that he was protecting his training ground from an intruder. It was ending with him understanding that he'd found a commanding officer who actually understood what that training ground represented. The base was quieter now, most personnel having secured for the evening. Tomorrow would bring the formal ceremony, the official transfer of authority, the public face of military leadership. But tonight, under a darkening California sky, the real work had already begun. Captain Addison Thorne had come to observe her new command. What she'd found was a team with exceptional skills but preventable weaknesses. What they'd found in her was a leader who could shoot, who could fight, and most importantly, who understood the difference between authority and respect. And Garrett Weston, who'd started the day as an instructor, protecting his territory, ended it as an advisor helping to shape the future of SEAL Team 7. All because he'd thrown water at the wrong woman and she'd had the wisdom to turn his mistake into something meaningful. As they parted ways at the administrative building, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that Team 7 had just gotten very lucky. Not because they had avoided a disaster, but because they'd found a leader worth following. Tomorrow would be interesting. But then again, in naval special warfare, tomorrow always was. The morning of December 15th arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only Southern California could produce in winter. Captain Addison Thorne stood before the mirror in her temporary quarters, adjusting the collar of her dress-white uniform. The fabric was crisp and clean-pressed to regulation perfection. Her ribbons were arranged precisely, each one representing a moment of service, sacrifice, or valor. The Navy Cross sat among them, a reminder of Somalia and the choices that had brought her to this moment. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar ritual of preparing for a formal military ceremony. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of yesterday. The water hitting her face, Garrett Weston's expression when he realized what he'd done. The moment of decision when she'd chosen mercy over punishment. Leadership wasn't about the ceremonies. It was about moments like those when no cameras were watching and the only witnesses were the people whose lives you'd be responsible for. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Ma'am, the car is here." The ceremony was held on the parade ground at precisely 1000 hours. Admiral Richard Preston conducted the official proceedings with military precision. Commander James Briggs, the outgoing CO, gave a gracious speech praising the men of Team 7 and expressing confidence in Captain Thorne's ability to lead them into the future. Then it was Addison's turn. She took the podium and looked out at the assembled faces. Some she recognized from yesterday. Others were new operators who'd been deployed or on leave when she'd arrived. "Thank you, Commander Briggs, for your service and your leadership," Addison began. "Yesterday, someone asked me what kind of leader I intend to be. I didn't answer then because I believe that leadership is demonstrated through actions rather than declarations. But I can tell you what I value. I value competence. I value integrity. I value the courage to admit when we're wrong and the wisdom to learn from our mistakes." Several people in Team 7 exchanged glances. They knew she was talking about yesterday. "Leadership is earned daily," Addison continued. "It's earned in training. It's earned in combat. It's earned in the 1,000 small decisions we make when we think no one important is watching. My promise to you is simple. I will lead from the front. I will hold myself to the same standards I demand from you. And I will always prioritize bringing every member of this team home alive." The ceremony concluded with the symbolic reading of orders. When it was over, Addison was immediately surrounded by well-wishers. Through it all, she kept one eye on her new team, clustered together in a corner, processing and debating their new commanding officer. After 30 minutes, a woman approached. Sarah Weston, Garrett's wife. Up close, Addison could see the fine lines of worry around her eyes, the marks of years spent wondering if her husband would come home from the next deployment. "Captain Thorne," Sarah said quietly, "I'm Sarah Weston, Garrett's wife. Could I have a moment?" They moved to a quieter section. Sarah's hands were clasped in front of her knuckles, white with tension. "I want to thank you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, "for what you did yesterday. Garrett called me last night and told me everything. He was terrified he'd ruined his career, that he'd thrown away 15 years of service because he let his emotions get the better of him. Your husband is an exceptional NCO, Addison replied. One mistake doesn't erase years of excellence. Sarah's eyes glistened. 3 years ago, Garrett was passed over for promotion to Master Chief for the first time. They said he was too rigid, too inflexible. It devastated him. He started doubting himself. Yesterday could have been the final proof that they were right. But instead, you showed him that strength and compassion aren't opposites. You gave him back his confidence, Captain. Addison placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. He earned that second chance by taking responsibility. Not everyone would have done that. The reception gradually dispersed. As people filtered out, Addison found herself standing with Admiral Preston on the building's balcony looking out over the base. You made the right decision about Weston, Preston said. Mercy but not weakness. Accountability without cruelty. That's going to define your command. The next week brought immediate changes to Team 7. Captain Thorne implemented the recommendations she and Garrett had discussed. Mixed teams for all training exercises. Challenging scenarios designed to expose weaknesses. The resistance came faster than expected. On Monday morning, Addison assembled the entire team for a briefing. 43 operators filled the room, veterans and newer team members, all curious about what their new CO had planned. Gentlemen, Addison began, starting today, we're implementing a new training protocol. All exercises will be conducted with integrated teams. Veterans will be paired with operators who have less than 2 years with the unit. No exceptions. The room remained silent, but Addison could read the body language. Several of the senior operators exchanged glances. Chief Langford looked thoughtful but neutral. Petty Officer Barnes, a 10-year veteran and the team's primary sniper, crossed his arms. Ma'am, Barnes said, raising his hand, with respect, we've developed working relationships with our regular teammates. We know how each other moves, thinks, reacts. Splitting us up could actually decrease our effectiveness. It was a reasonable objection delivered professionally, but Addison had expected this. I understand your concern, Petty Officer Barnes, she replied, and you're right that established relationships are valuable. But answer me this. What happens when one of your regular teammates goes down? What happens when you're forced to operate with someone you've never trained with because that's who's available? Barnes didn't have an immediate answer. Integration isn't about destroying what works, Addison continued. It's about making sure everyone can work with everyone. That's how you build a truly resilient team. The first integrated training exercise was scheduled for Wednesday. The scenario was a nighttime hostage rescue in an urban environment. 4 teams of 4 operators each. Each team had 2 veterans and 2 newer operators. Garrett supervised as team leader, with Addison observing from the Tactical Operations Center. It was a disaster. Team 1, led by Chief Langford, completed the objective but took 47 minutes. The standard was 30. Team 2, with Barnes as the senior operator, had a simulated friendly fire incident when communication broke down between the veteran sniper and his younger spotter. Team 3 never made it past the initial breach because the veterans and newer operators couldn't agree on the entry method. Only Team 4, led by Petty Officer Beckett, the team medic, completed the exercise within acceptable parameters, and even they had struggled. After the exercise, Addison called everyone together. The operators looked frustrated, embarrassed, angry. They just failed at something they should have been able to do in their sleep. That, Addison said, letting the silence stretch, was unacceptable. The operator shifted uncomfortably, but it was also exactly what I expected. You've all gotten comfortable operating with the same people, using the same methods, falling into the same patterns. And those patterns just got exposed. The question now is what you're going to do about it. Chief Langford raised his hand. Ma'am, we need more practice with these integrated teams. We can't expect to function as a unit after one training session. Agreed, Addison said, which is why we're running this scenario again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night until you can execute it flawlessly. A collective groan went through the room, quickly stifled. Welcome to the new Team 7, gentlemen. We're going to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Any questions? There were none, at least not out loud. Over the next 2 weeks, something remarkable happened. The integrated teams that had struggled initially began to gel. Veterans learned to trust the fresh perspectives of newer operators. Younger team members absorbed the hard-won wisdom of those with more experience. The breakthrough came during a training evolution in week 3. Team 2, One that had suffered the simulated friendly fire incident was running a vehicle interdiction scenario. Barnes, the veteran sniper, was paired with Seaman First Class Mitchell, a 24-year-old operator fresh from advanced training. The scenario called for stopping a vehicle convoy, extracting a high-value target from the middle vehicle, and exfiltrating before enemy reinforcements arrived. Time limit 20 minutes. Addison watched from the TOC as Team 2 approached the target. Barnes was in overwatch position on a rooftop providing security. Mitchell was with the assault element on the ground. The convoy appeared. The assault team moved to intercept. But as they approached, Mitchell spotted something that didn't match the intelligence brief. A fourth vehicle not included in the scenario parameters. Viper 2, this is Viper ground, Mitchell radioed to Barnes. I've got eyes on an unknown vehicle 50 meters east of target 2, requesting guidance. Barnes had two choices. Stick to the plan, which called for engaging only pre-designated targets, or trust his younger teammates' instincts and adapt. Viper ground, hold position, Barnes responded. I've got eyes on the unknown, evaluating. Through his scope, Barnes could see that the unknown vehicle contained additional hostile role players. It was an ambush element added by the scenario designers to test adaptability. Viper ground, this is Viper 2, unknown as hostile, recommend abort current's approach and flank from the north. It was the right call, and it came from trusting a younger operator's observation and adapting the plan in real time. Team 2 completed the exercise in 18 minutes with perfect execution. After the debrief, Addison approached Barnes privately. That was good work out there, petty officer. You trusted your teammate and adapted when it mattered. Barnes nodded slowly. I'll be honest, ma'am. I didn't want these integrated teams. Thought it was unnecessary, but Mitchell saved our asses today. Kids got good instincts, and I wouldn't have seen them if you hadn't forced us to work together. It was the validation Addison had been waiting for. If she could win over Barnes, one of the most respected and stubborn veterans on the team, the culture shift was real. By the end of January, Team 7 looked like a different unit. The complacency that had worried both her and Garrett had been eliminated. The divide between veterans and newer operators had closed. They'd become, in the truest sense, a team. But Addison knew that training evolutions, no matter how realistic, weren't the same as actual operations. The real test would come when they deployed. That test came sooner than expected. In early February, Team 7 received orders for an advisory mission. They would deploy to an unnamed location in the Middle East to train local security forces in counterterrorism tactics. No direct combat role, but high-pressure diplomacy and the kind of patient instruction that required different skills than kicking down doors. Garrett would lead the ground element of 12 operators. Addison would coordinate with host nation leadership and manage the strategic aspects of the mission. The mission lasted 6 weeks. During that time, Team 7 trained over 200 local security personnel in everything from basic marksmanship to complex raid planning. The work was tedious, often frustrating, and required the kind of cultural sensitivity that didn't come naturally to most door kickers. But it also required exactly the kind of integration that Addison had been building. Veterans like Barnes and Langford had the experience to understand tactical principles at a deep level. But the younger operators, many of whom were closer in age to the local security forces, had an easier time building rapport and communicating effectively. The breakthrough moment came in week 4. Team 7 was conducting a live-fire training exercise with local forces when one of the local trainees made a critical error with his weapon. The situation could have resulted in serious injury. Seaman Mitchell, the same young operator who'd spotted the ambush element in training, was supervising that particular firing line. He immediately recognized the error, physically intervened to correct the weapon handling, and then spent 20 minutes working one-on-one with the trainee to ensure he understood what had gone wrong and why. It was exactly the kind of patient, ego-free instruction that built trust and competence. That evening, the local security force commander approached Addison with genuine gratitude. "Your young sergeant," he said, referring to Mitchell, "he saved my man's life today, and he did it without embarrassing him in front of his peers. That takes wisdom beyond his years." Addison filed that observation away. She'd been watching Mitchell along with several other younger operators. They represented the future of Team 7, and she needed to make sure they were being developed properly. The team returned to Coronado in late March to news that they'd been selected for the Naval Special Warfare Command Excellence Award. The recognition was for sustained operational excellence and training innovation. Addison attended the awards ceremony in Virginia Beach, accepted the plaque on behalf of her team, and immediately flew back to California. Awards were nice, but they didn't complete missions or bring operators home alive. What mattered more was the promotion list that came out in April. Garrett Weston's name was on it. After 3 years of being passed over, he'd finally been selected for Master Chief Petty Officer. The promotion ceremony was held on a Friday afternoon in May. Addison had the honor of pinning on his new rank insignia while Sarah and their children watched with pride. "Master Chief Weston," Addison said formally after the pinning, "you've earned this through years of exceptional service and a demonstrated ability to grow as a leader. Congratulations." "Thank you, ma'am," Garrett replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I wouldn't be here without the second chance you gave me." "You earned it, Master Chief. Never forget that." June brought a new class of SEAL recruits to Coronado. 23 young men fresh from basic underwater demolition SEAL training, ready to begin the process of becoming full-fledged members of the Special Operations community. Master Chief Garrett Weston stood before them on the same training ground where 6 months earlier he'd thrown water at his commanding officer. "Welcome to SEAL Team 7, Garrett began. "Over the next 6 months, you're going to learn what it means to be part of the finest Special Operations unit in the world. But before we begin your training, I'm going to tell you a story. It's about the day I threw water on my commanding officer." He had their attention now, confused glances exchanged between recruits. Garrett told them everything. The civilian woman he had thought was an intruder, the confrontation that had escalated beyond reason, the moment he'd lost control, the horrifying realization of who she was, and most importantly, her decision to show mercy rather than destroy him. "I expected to be court-martialed," Garrett said. "Instead, Captain Thorne taught me the most important lesson of my military service, that leaders who lift others up are stronger than leaders who crush them, that mercy and accountability can coexist." One of the recruits raised his hand. "Master Chief, where is Captain Thorne now?" Garrett smiled. "Why don't you ask her yourself?" He gestured toward the back of the formation, and the recruits turned to see Captain Addison Thorne standing there in her working uniform, arms crossed, a slight smile on her face. She walked forward to stand beside Garrett. "Master Chief Weston told you that story because it's important for you to understand something from day one," Addison said. "You're going to make mistakes, all of you, some small, some potentially career-ending. What matters isn't the mistake itself, but what you do after. Do you take responsibility? Do you learn? Do you become better?" She glanced at Garrett, and something passed between them. Mutual respect earned through shared experience. "Master Chief Weston could have made excuses," Addison continued. "Instead, he stood at attention, accepted full responsibility, and showed me that he was worth the risk. That's the kind of character we need in naval special warfare." The story of the water incident spread through the special operations community. It was told at training schools, referenced in leadership courses, discussed in quiet conversations between operators who understood the weight of command. But for Addison and Garrett, it remained something simpler. The day they learned that the best leaders aren't the ones who never make mistakes, but the ones who know what to do with the second chance they're given. 5 years passed. 5 years of successful missions, of lives saved, of younger operators trained and developed. 5 years of building Team 7 into something exceptional. On a December morning in 2030, Master Chief Garrett Weston stood before a graduating class of Navy SEALs. He was no longer just a senior enlisted advisor to one team. He'd risen to become the head of Advanced SEAL Training at Coronado, responsible for shaping the next generation. 47 newly graduated SEALs sat before him, having just completed one of the most grueling training pipelines in the military. They wore the trident, now that sacred symbol of their achievement. But Garrett had one more lesson to teach them. "Let me tell you about the day I threw water on my commanding officer," he began. He told the story he'd told hundreds of times now, refined through repetition, but never losing its essential truth. The graduates listened rapt. When Garrett finished, he paused, then gestured to the VIP section. "And that commanding officer, she's sitting right over there." Captain Addison Thorne, now 43 and wearing the rank sheet earned through 7 years of exceptional command, smiled and gave a small wave. She'd been promoted twice more, had led multiple teams through countless successful missions, and was now being considered for admiral. After the ceremony, Garrett found Addison waiting for him near the beach. They'd maintained a friendship over the years, a professional relationship that had deepened into genuine mutual respect. They walked along the beach in civilian clothes, the December sun warm on their faces. "You've trained over 1,500 SEALs now," Addison observed. "How many times have you told that story?" "Every single class," Garrett replied. "It's the most important lesson I know. That mercy and accountability can coexist. That leaders who lift others are stronger than leaders who crush them." They walked in comfortable silence, watching young SEALs run PT on the beach. Garrett pulled a water bottle from his pack and took a drink, then held it out to Addison with a mischievous grin. "Want some?" Addison laughed. "Don't even think about it, Master Chief." They tapped their own water bottles together. "To second chances," Garrett said. "To proving we deserve them," Addison replied. The sun continued its arc across the California sky. Waves rolled endlessly onto the sand. Somewhere on the base behind them, another class of recruits was beginning their journey. And two leaders who'd started their relationship with a moment of crisis had become living examples of what military leadership could be when it prioritized growth over punishment. Years later, when other leaders faced similar moments, when they had to choose between destroying someone for a mistake or finding a way to lift them up, instead they would think of the water incident. They would think of a sergeant who threw water at his commanding officer and a captain who had the wisdom to see past the action to the character beneath. That was the real legacy. Not records broken or awards received, but the ripple effect of one wise decision spreading across years and generations. The water had dried long ago, but the impact of that moment would last forever.